On the night before Thanksgiving, 1971, a quiet man in a business suit hijacked a Boeing 727. Extorted a fortune in cash, and then did the unthinkable. He strapped the money to his body, lowered the rear stairs of the plane, and jumped from 10,000 feet into a freezing storm over the vast American wilderness. He was never seen or heard from again. This is the story of D.B. Cooper, a man who became a ghost, pulling off the only unsolved skyjacking in American history, and leaving behind a perfect mystery that would baffle the FBI and captivate the world for over 50 years. Welcome to the Dark Chapters. The date was November 24th, 1971. It was the day before Thanksgiving, one of the busiest and most quintessentially American travel days of the year. Airports across the country were bustling with families and homebound college students, a cheerful chaos of holiday anticipation. At Portland International Airport in Oregon, the scene was no different. The air was damp and chilly, the sky a blanket of bruised Pacific Northwest gray. Among the crowds, a man walked toward the gate for Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 35, a short, routine commuter hop to Seattle. He was utterly, almost invisibly, unremarkable. He approached the ticket counter and purchased a one-way ticket for the 30-minute flight, paying with a $20 bill. He gave his name as Dan Cooper. He was a man in his mid-40s, perhaps 6 feet tall, with a quiet, polite demeanor. He was dressed not as a traveler, but as a businessman who had just stepped out of a meeting, wearing a dark suit, a crisp white-collared shirt, a narrow black tie held in place with a mother-of-pearl tie clip, and a black raincoat. He carried a dark attaché case. He looked like any one of 1,000 anonymous executives crisscrossing the country that day. He boarded the Boeing 727, took his seat in the last row, seat 18C, and calmly ordered a bourbon and soda, which he paid for before the plane even took off. Nothing about him drew attention. Nothing about him suggested he was about to become an American folk legend by executing the most audacious and perfect skyjacking in history. Shortly after takeoff, as the plane climbed through the Oregon sky, Cooper's plan began to unfold with the cool precision of a chess master. He caught the eye of a flight attendant, a 23-year-old named Florence Schaffner. He handed her a folded piece of paper. In the casual, often flirtatious environment of 1970s air travel, Schaffner assumed it was just another lonely businessman passing her his phone number. Uninterested, she slipped the note unread into her purse. She began to walk away, but Cooper leaned into the aisle and spoke to her, his voice low and devoid of any discernible emotion. "Miss," he said, "you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." A cold shock ran through Florence Schaffner. She retrieved the note from her purse. The words, written in neat, all-capital letters with a felt-tip pen, were chillingly direct. The note informed her that he was indeed carrying a bomb in his briefcase and that he wanted her to sit with him. Stunned, she did as she was told, taking the seat next to him. He was calm, almost serene. He quietly asked her to look in the briefcase. She glanced over as he unlatched it, just enough for her to see what was inside. Her eyes fell upon a terrifying sight. A tangle of wires connected to 8 red sticks, which she assumed were dynamite, and a large battery. There was no doubt in her mind that the device was real. Cooper then closed the briefcase and in that same placid, businesslike tone stated his demands. He wanted 2 things. First, $200,000, 0 cents in cash, specifically unmarked $20 bills. Second, he wanted 4 parachutes, 2 primary back-chute parachutes and 2 reserve chest-mounted parachutes. He instructed her to write it all down and take the note to the captain. As she stood up, shaken, to go to the cockpit, he added one final, cool instruction. Don't get scared. In the cockpit, Captain William Scott and his crew listened in stunned disbelief as Schaffner relayed the hijacker's demands. The politeness of the man was what made it so terrifying. There was no shouting, no hysterical threats. This was not a desperate man on the edge. This was a man who was utterly in control, not just of the situation, but of himself. The captain immediately radioed Seattle Tacoma Air Traffic Control, who in turn contacted the FBI. The president of Northwest Orient Airlines, Donald Nurop, made the decision to cooperate fully. The safety of the 36 passengers and 6 crew members on board was paramount. While the crew in the cockpit began a tense, coded conversation with the ground, the passengers in the main cabin remained blissfully unaware. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calmly explaining that they would be delayed due to a minor mechanical issue and would need to circle the Seattle area for a while. On the ground, a frantic, high-stakes operation swung into motion. FBI agents and police scrambled to meet the hijackers' precise demands. Gathering $200,000, 0 cents, in unmarked 20s on the eve of a major holiday was a monumental task. Runners were dispatched to multiple Seattle area banks to pull the cash, which was then painstakingly photographed, each of the 10,000 bills recorded for later identification. Simultaneously, an equally urgent search was underway for the parachutes. An order was put out to McCord Air Force Base, but Cooper had been specific about wanting civilian parachutes. Agents located a local skydiving school, and the owner was summoned to bring his best gear to the airport. The authorities had made a decision. They would give him exactly what he wanted, but they would make sure the parachutes were military issue, believing them to be less reliable for a novice. However, the expert on site refused, insisting on providing high-quality, professional civilian chutes, arguing that faulty gear could cause the hijacker to panic and detonate the bomb. Reluctantly, the authorities agreed. The parachutes were brought to the airport, hastily inspected, and prepared for delivery. As darkness fell over Puget Sound, Flight 305 finally landed at Seattle Tacoma International Airport just before 6:00 p.m. Acting on Cooper's instructions, the plane taxied to a remote, brightly lit section of the tarmac, far from the main terminals. To deter police snipers, Cooper had the cabin lights dimmed. The air inside the plane was thick with tension, yet Cooper remained a picture of calm. The exchange was executed with surgical precision. A single airline employee drove a car out to the plane, delivering a knapsack filled with the cash and the 4 parachutes. Once the items were brought on board and inspected by Cooper, he held up his end of the bargain. He allowed all 36 passengers and 2 of the flight attendants, including Florence Schaffner, to deplane. The passengers, confused but relieved, walked down the air stairs into the cold, rainy night, having no idea they had been hostages in a federal crime for the past several hours. Now, the second act of the Perfect Hijack began. The plane sat on the tarmac, refueling, with only its essential flight crew and 1 hijacker on board. Cooper calmly laid out the next phase of his plan to the remaining crew members. His instructions revealed a startling degree of aviation knowledge. He demanded they fly toward Mexico City, with a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. The flight path was to be specific. They were to stay under 10,000 feet of altitude, and their speed was to be kept below 150 knots. Crucially, he instructed them to fly with the landing gear down and the wing flaps lowered to a 15-degree angle. To the pilots, these were not the random demands of an amateur. This was the precise flight configuration required to depressurize the cabin and slow the aircraft enough to make a parachute jump from a commercial jetliner survivable. He even knew which model of 727 they were on, and knew that it was equipped with an aft air staircase. A staircase at the rear of the plane that could be lowered during flight. This was his intended exit. He was calm, he was knowledgeable, and he was in complete control. After a tense 2 hours on the ground, the refueling was complete. At approximately 7:40 p.m., Flight 345, now a near-empty vessel carrying a Phantom and a Fortune, took off from Seattle and ascended into the stormy black sky, heading south into legend. As Northwest Orient Flight 305 clawed its way back into the turbulent black sky above Seattle, it was no longer a passenger plane. It was a ghost ship, a vessel commandeered by a phantom. On board, the atmosphere was thick with a unique, chilling silence. In the front, the pilots, Captain William Scott and his first officer, were focused intently on their instruments, flying the massive Boeing 727 in a highly unusual and dangerous configuration, low, slow, with its landing gear down. In the rear of the cabin sat the hijacker, Dan Cooper, now in sole possession of the passenger cabin, along with a knapsack containing his $200,000 0-cents ransom. With him remained one flight attendant, Tina Mucklow, who had bravely volunteered to stay behind. She was his last hostage, his only link to the crew in the cockpit. The flight path south towards Reno was a corridor of pure tension. Cooper, who had remained preternaturally calm throughout the entire ordeal, continued to be a figure of quiet authority. He was polite, almost considerate, ensuring Tina Mucklow was not overly frightened. He even tried to give her some of the ransom money, a gesture she adamantly refused. From the cockpit, the pilots could only obey his strange commands, their minds racing to understand his ultimate plan. They knew the aft air stair, the staircase at the tail of the 727, was his intended exit. They knew his specific flight parameters were designed to make a parachute jump possible, but the sheer audacity of it in these conditions was almost incomprehensible. Unbeknownst to Cooper, as the 727 lumbered through the sky, a military response was already underway. 2 F-16 fighter jets had been scrambled from a nearby Air Force base to tail the airliner, but the conditions that night rendered them almost useless. The weather was atrocious, a storm front battering the region with freezing rain, low-lying clouds, and gusting wind. The fighter jets, designed for high-speed intercepts, struggled to fly as slowly as the crippled 727. Their pilots strained their eyes, peering through the rain-streaked darkness, trying to keep the airliner in sight. But from their position, it was impossible to see the rear of the plane. Impossible to know what was happening at the aft air stair. They were shadowing a ghost, completely unaware of the critical moment when history would be made. Inside the cabin, Cooper began his final preparations. The moment was approaching. With the same lack of emotion he had displayed all evening, he instructed Tina Mucklow on how to open the aft air stair. Then, in a final act of something that could almost be mistaken for consideration, he told her to go into the cockpit, close the curtain, and not come out. He wanted no witnesses. He wanted her to be safe. It was the last time any human being would ever report seeing the man who called himself Dan Cooper. Alone in the rear of the cabin, he went about his final tasks. He would have had to strap the heavy knapsack of cash to his body, a difficult and awkward procedure. He would have donned one of the parachute harnesses, a complex series of straps and buckles that would be nearly impossible to fit correctly for a novice, especially in the cramped, swaying fuselage of an airplane. He then had to lower the heavy air stair into the deafening, freezing slipstream. The roar of the wind and engines would have been immense, a physical assault of sound and pressure. At precisely 8:13 p.m., as the plane flew through a violent thunderstorm somewhere over the dense, rugged wilderness of southwestern Washington state, the pilots in the cockpit noticed a sudden change. A warning light flickered on, indicating that the aft staircase was unlocked and open. Simultaneously, they felt a subtle but distinct oscillation, a slight upward bump in the tail of the aircraft, the kind of pressure change that would occur when a body exited the plane. That was it. There was no shout, No final message, just a brief mechanical indication that something had happened. The man known as Dan Cooper had stepped off that staircase and into oblivion. He had plunged into the heart of a storm, in the dead of night, into one of the most hostile environments imaginable for a skydive. The temperature at 10,000 feet would have been well below freezing, and the wind chill at 150 knots would have been catastrophic, estimated at nearly 70 degrees below zero. He was jumping into a freezing torrential downpour, with winds that would have sent him hurtling sideways, making any kind of controlled descent impossible. Below him lay an endless, unforgiving expanse of dense forest, treacherous mountains, and raging rivers. He was jumping into a black void, a place from which it was almost impossible to believe anyone could emerge alive. For the next 2 hours, the plane continued its eerie flight south, the aft staircase still dragging open in the wind. The crew had no way of knowing if Cooper was truly gone or if he was still clinging to the stairs. They flew on, maintaining the course for Reno. When they finally landed at Reno International Airport shortly before midnight, the scene was one of military precision. The plane was immediately surrounded by a cordon of FBI agents and local police, their weapons drawn, floodlights cutting through the darkness. For what felt like an eternity, they waited, expecting a confrontation. Finally, after establishing that there was no movement on board, a team of agents cautiously ascended the forward stairs and began a sweep of the aircraft. The plane was empty. Dan Cooper was gone. All that remained were the cryptic clues he had chosen to leave behind. On the seats, investigators found his black clip-on tie and mother-of-pearl tie clip. They found 8 filter-tipped Raleigh cigarette butts in the ashtray. And most curiously, they found 2 of the 4 parachutes he had demanded. One was a primary chute, the other a reserve. An expert examination quickly revealed a stunning detail. The reserve parachute he had left behind was a non-functional training model, one that had been sewn shut for classroom demonstrations. Cooper, in the tense, hurried moments on the Seattle tarmac, had been knowledgeable enough to inspect the gear he was given and identify the useless chute, calmly discarding it and choosing a functional one for his jump. This small detail spoke volumes about his expertise. This was no amateur. The story and the mystery exploded. A wire service reporter, in a rush to meet a deadline, mistakenly combined the name on the ticket, Dan Cooper, with the name of a local Oregon man who the FBI had briefly questioned and cleared, a man named D.B. Cooper. The mistake stuck. From that day forward, the Phantom of Flight 345 would forever be known as D.B. Cooper. The legend was born. The man had not only successfully hijacked a plane, extorted a fortune, and engineered a high-risk escape, but he had managed to do the one thing that seemed impossible in the modern world. He had disappeared into thin air, utterly and completely. As the FBI launched what would become one of the longest and most exhaustive manhunts in American history, they were faced with a chilling reality. They weren't just looking for a criminal, they were looking for a ghost who had jumped out of a plane and into a legend, leaving nothing behind but a black tie and a perfect, impenetrable mystery. In the cold, floodlit aftermath at Reno International Airport, as FBI agents meticulously combed through the empty shell of Flight 355, the reality of the situation began to set in. They were at the very beginning of what would become one of the longest, most expensive, and most maddening investigations in the history of American law enforcement. The man who called himself Dan Cooper had not just disappeared, he had vaporized, leaving behind a handful of cryptic clues and a mystery so perfect it felt less like a crime and more like a magic trick. The hunt for D.B. Cooper, codenamed Norjack for Northwest Hijacking, had begun, and it would quickly devolve into the biggest wild goose chase the Bureau had ever known. The immediate and most critical task was to find where he had landed. Working with the pilots, The FBI attempted to reconstruct the flight path and pinpoint the exact moment of the jump at 8:13 p.m. The variables were a nightmare. The plane had been flying through a violent storm with unpredictable, gusting winds. The aircraft's precise location over the rugged terrain was not exact. The result was a search area that spanned hundreds of square miles of some of the most unforgiving wilderness in the continental United States. A vast, tangled landscape of dense forests, steep mountains, and deep ravines in southwestern Washington. The scale of the ground search was monumental. In the days following the jump, more than 400 soldiers from nearby Fort Lewis were deployed, forming human chains to comb through the dense, rain-soaked undergrowth. They were joined by FBI agents, local sheriff's deputies, and civilian volunteers. Helicopters and small planes crisscrossed the sky, their crews scanning the vast canopy of trees for any sign of a parachute, a body, or a campsite. The conditions were atrocious. The terrain was treacherous, covered in thick brush and fallen logs, making every foot of progress an exhaustive battle. The relentless November rain turned the ground to mud and swelled the rivers, making the search not only difficult, but dangerous. Days turned into weeks, and the search yielded absolutely nothing. Not a single scrap of the parachute, not a shred of clothing, not a trace of the man himself. It was as if the forest had simply swallowed him whole. The FBI even brought in a submarine to search the depths of Lake Merwin, a large reservoir within the potential landing zone, on the remote chance he had landed in the water. The submarine scanned the lakebed for days, but found nothing. The massive, expensive, and physically grueling ground search was a complete and utter failure. Simultaneously, a parallel investigation was focused on the few pieces of physical evidence Cooper had left behind. The 8 Raleigh cigarette butts yielded no identifiable fingerprints. His black clip-on tie, however, became an object of intense scrutiny. Decades later, using powerful electron microscopes, forensic scientists would discover something remarkable on the tie. Thousands of tiny particles of rare earth elements, including pure, unalloyed titanium and an alloy of stainless steel and titanium. This was not the kind of material found in everyday life. It pointed to a specific industrial background. The elemental profile suggested that Cooper might have been a chemist, a metallurgist, or perhaps an engineer working at a high-tech manufacturing or aerospace facility, possibly even for a contractor like Boeing, the very company that built the 727 he hijacked. But in 1971, this level of forensic science was in its infancy, and the tie offered few immediate leads. The most crucial evidence, of course, was the ransom money. The FBI had meticulously photographed every one of the 10,000 $20 bills. The list of serial numbers was compiled and distributed to virtually every financial institution in the country and beyond. Banks, casinos, racetracks, and law enforcement agencies worldwide were put on high alert, instructed to watch for the Cooper bills. The FBI was certain that if Cooper had survived, he would eventually need to spend the money. They believed it was only a matter of time before one of the marked bills surfaced, giving them a geographical anchor, a place to start looking for their man. But as the weeks turned into months and months into years, the financial trail remained as cold as the ground search. Not a single one of the 10,000 bills appeared anywhere. With no physical trail, the investigation turned to the human element. The flight attendants, particularly Florence Schaffner and Tina Mucklow, were interviewed exhaustively. They provided the description that would form the basis of the now-iconic composite sketch. A man in his mid-40s, between 5'10" and 6 tall, with a quiet demeanor, dark eyes, and an olive complexion. Yet, even here there was ambiguity. He was described as being utterly average, a face you would instantly forget. He was not threatening, not nervous, not memorable in any way. The sketch was released to the public, and the floodgates opened. The Norjack case file swelled with thousands of leads, tips, and false confessions. Every petty criminal, barstool braggart, and disgruntled ex-paratrooper who vaguely matched the description was investigated. The FBI waded through a deluge of crackpot theories and attention seekers. They investigated over 800 suspects in the first year alone, clearing almost all of them. They looked for men with grudges against Northwest Orient Airlines, men with financial troubles, men with skydiving experience. Yet every lead led to a dead end. The man seemed to have no past. He had no known associates. The name Dan Cooper was a fiction, a blank slate that matched no one of consequence. The FBI was left with a maddening profile of their suspect. He was bold, intelligent, and meticulously prepared. His knowledge of the Boeing 727 systems, the specific flight parameters for a safe jump, and his ability to identify the faulty training parachute suggested a background in aviation or military parachuting. Yet, his plan seemed almost suicidal. Jumping into a freezing storm at night over treacherous terrain was something no sane, experienced skydiver would ever attempt. This central contradiction baffled investigators. Was he a seasoned expert who got incredibly lucky, or a reckless amateur who almost certainly died in the attempt? As the first anniversary of the hijacking passed with no new developments, the FBI's Biggest Wild Goose Chase had become a source of profound institutional frustration. They had the largest and most sophisticated law enforcement agency in the world, yet they were completely stumped by a single man. He had extorted a fortune, defied the authorities, and vanished without a trace, leaving them chasing shadows in the woods and phantom numbers in bank ledgers. The perfect crime remained stubbornly, infuriatingly perfect. The forest held its secrets, the money remained hidden, and the ghost of D.B. Cooper floated free, laughing at the most extensive manhunt in American history. As the years bled into decades, the official FBI investigation into the Norjack case grew colder and colder. The ground search had failed, and the money had vanished. With no new evidence to pursue, the active manhunt slowly withered, transitioning from a frontline federal case into a lingering, frustrating cold case. But where the official investigation stalled, an unofficial one exploded. The mystery of D.B. Cooper became a great American pastime, a puzzle that captivated the public imagination. The vacuum left by the lack of facts was eagerly filled by amateur sleuths, investigative journalists, and armchair detectives. The Norjack case file swelled not just with tips, but with suspects, a long and fascinating parade of men whose lives, backgrounds, and even deathbed confessions seemed to align with the phantom of Flight 3. The search for Cooper became a search through the lives of these enigmatic figures, each one a potential key to unlocking the nation's greatest unsolved mystery. Perhaps the most compelling and hotly debated suspect to ever emerge was a man named Richard McCoy, Jr. The similarities between his case and Cooper's are so striking that many, including some of the original FBI agents on the case, remain convinced they were one and the same. Just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, in April of 1972, a man boarded a United Airlines flight in Denver. Shortly after takeoff, he handed a flight attendant a note informing her that he had a live hand grenade and a plan. The methods were an eerie echo of the Norjack case. McCoy demanded 4 parachutes and $500,000 in cash. He was a Vietnam veteran, a former Green Beret, a demolition expert, and an avid skydiver. After receiving the ransom, he too jumped from the rear air stair of a Boeing 727. But Richard McCoy was not D.B. Cooper. He was caught. In his hubris, he had been careless, leaving behind evidence, including his own handwriting, that led the FBI directly to his door. He was a married father and a Sunday school teacher, living a double life that had finally caught up with him. When presented as a suspect in the Cooper case, however, the evidence began to diverge. The flight attendants from Flight 305 did not positively identify him from photographs. McCoy's physical description didn't quite match the man they remembered. Furthermore, McCoy always and vehemently denied being Cooper, even after being convicted for his own skyjacking. He later staged a daring prison escape, but was killed in a subsequent shootout with law enforcement in 1974. The question of whether he was D.B. Cooper, perhaps having learned from mistakes he made on a practice run, officially died with him, leaving behind one of the most tantalizing what-ifs in criminal history. As the years passed, other compelling suspects emerged from the shadows, often brought to light by their own families after their deaths. In 1995, a man named Dwayne Weber lay dying in a Florida hospital. He turned to his wife of 17 years, Jo, and whispered 5 words that would change her life. "I am Dan Cooper." Jo Weber had never heard the name before, but after his death, she began a personal investigation that unearthed a trove of hauntingly circumstantial evidence. She recalled a nightmare her husband once had, where he talked in his sleep about jumping from a plane and leaving his fingerprints on the aft stair. She remembered an old knee injury he claimed he'd gotten from jumping out of a plane. She found an old plane ticket for a flight to Seattle from around the time of the hijacking. Jo's research revealed that her husband's physical appearance was a strong match for the composite sketch. He had a long criminal record and had spent time in a prison conveniently located near Portland. He had served in the Army during the Korean War. The pieces seemed to fit so perfectly that Jo became convinced her husband was the hijacker. She contacted the FBI and became a fixture in the community of Cooper researchers. For years, Dwayne Weber was considered one of the strongest suspects. The theory, however, came to a definitive end in the early 2000s. The FBI, having managed to extract a partial DNA profile from the saliva on the cigarette butts or the skin cells on the tie Cooper left behind, compared it to Dwayne Weber's DNA. It was not a match. Weber was officially ruled out, but the chilling deathbed confession and his wife's determined quest for the truth cemented his place in the Cooper canon. Another compelling candidate put forth by his own brother was a man named Kenneth Christensen. His profile was intriguing not because of a criminal background, but because of his professional one. Christensen was a former Northwest Orient Airlines purser, an employee of the very airline Cooper had targeted. This position would have given him intimate knowledge of the airline's procedures and the layout of their aircraft. He was also a former Army paratrooper from World War II. He smoked, he drank bourbon, the same drink Cooper ordered, and he lived in Washington. His brother Lyle recalled that after the hijacking, Kenneth bought a house with cash, a suspicious purchase for a man of his modest means. On his deathbed in 1994, he made a cryptic comment to Lyle, "There is something you should know, but I cannot tell you." After his death, Lyle became convinced his brother was the legendary skyjacker. The theory, however, had significant flaws. Christensen's physical appearance was a poor match for the description provided by the flight attendants. He was shorter, lighter, and his features were different. While his inside knowledge was tantalizing, the physical mismatch was too great for the FBI to ever consider him a primary suspect. The list goes on. In more recent years, a team of private investigators, led by author Thomas Colbert, championed a man named Robert Rackstraw, a decorated Vietnam veteran with extensive training in parachuting and explosives. They claimed to have decoded letters sent to newspapers after the hijacking, believing they contained coded messages pointing to Rackstraw's old Army units. The FBI, however, maintained that they had ruled Rackstraw out as a suspect decades prior, citing a poor physical match. Rackstraw himself died in 2019, basking in the notoriety until the very end. Each of these men, and dozens of others, represents a potential solution to the puzzle. Their stories are compelling narratives filled with circumstantial evidence and tantalizing coincidences that seem to almost fit perfectly. But in the world of criminal investigation, almost is the same as not at all. In every single case, a key piece of direct evidence is missing. A physical description is wrong, or a DNA test slams the door shut. The identity of the man on the plane remains as elusive as he was on that stormy night in 1971. The great FBI wild goose chase for the man himself had ended, only to be replaced by a new one. A public chase through the lives and histories of ghosts, each promising an answer that, like Cooper himself, vanishes just when you think you have it in your grasp. The years following the Norjack hijacking bled into a long, frustrating silence. The massive ground search had found nothing. The trail of suspects had grown cold, and not a single one of the 10,000-mark $20 bills had surfaced. The perfect crime remained stubbornly perfect, and the legend of D.B. Cooper slowly drifted from a pressing federal manhunt into the realm of American folklore. For nearly a decade, the case was a ghost story, a tale told around campfires, with no new evidence to anchor it to the real world. And then, in the winter of 1980, a discovery by an 8-year-old boy on a family vacation would blow the case wide open, providing the first and last piece of concrete physical evidence ever found. On a cold February afternoon, a young boy named Brian Ingram was digging in the sand on the banks of the Columbia River at a spot known as Tenna's Bar. His family was clearing a space for a beach fire when his hand hit something strange buried just inches beneath the surface. He pulled it out and found 3 decaying, tightly bound bundles of cash. The rubber bands holding them together were brittle. The bills were 20s. When Ingram's family took the money to the authorities, the FBI confirmed what seemed impossible. The serial numbers were a match. Brian Ingram had found a small piece of D.B. Cooper's ransom. The discovery sent a jolt through the cold case. Investigators swarmed Tenna's Bar, dredging the river and meticulously excavating the sand, hoping to find more money, or better yet, a parachute or human remains. They found nothing else. The discovery of the $5,800.00 raised far more questions than it answered. How did it get there? The location was miles downstream from the suspected jump zone, leading to complex theories about how the bundles could have washed down the river over the years. Some experts argued the way the packets were still bound together suggested they hadn't tumbled down the river for 9 years, but had perhaps been buried there. Did Cooper lose part of his ransom during the jump? Did he land nearby, bury the money, and perish in the wilderness, his body never to be found? Or did he successfully escape, and this small bundle was simply a casualty of his chaotic landing? The find was a bombshell, but it was a bombshell that only deepened the enigma. As the years marched on, the lack of new physical evidence was partially compensated for by the advent of modern forensic science. Investigators in the 21st century could now re-examine the few clues Cooper left behind with technology that seemed like science fiction in 1971. The most promising item was the black clip-on tie. Scientists were able to extract a partial DNA profile from skin cells left on the knot, a definitive biological signature of the hijacker. This DNA profile immediately became the ultimate tool for eliminating suspects. When the family of Duane Weber came forward with his deathbed confession, his DNA was tested against the sample from the tie. It was not a match. One by one, promising suspects could be definitively cleared, but the DNA profile never found a positive match, leaving the hijacker's identity a secret, locked in a genetic code with no known key. Even more fascinating was the advanced particle analysis conducted on the tie. Using a powerful electron microscope, scientists discovered a treasure trove of information woven into the fabric. The tie contained high concentrations of rare and specific elements, including pure titanium, bismuth, and an unusual stainless steel alloy. This was not everyday dust. This was industrial material pointing to a very specific professional life. The elemental signature strongly suggested that Cooper worked, or had worked, in a high-tech engineering or manufacturing environment. likely in the aerospace sector. One of the most compelling theories to arise from this discovery was that he may have been an engineer or a manager at a specialized facility, perhaps even at a Boeing plant, involved in the development of their supersonic transport SST program in the late 1960s. The profile fit a man who was not just a common criminal, but an intelligent, professional insider who likely felt wronged by a large corporation and possessed the technical knowledge to pull off the perfect crime. Despite these tantalizing scientific clues, the case remained fundamentally stalled. Finally, in July of 2016, after nearly 45 years of active investigation, the FBI officially announced they were closing the Norjak cold case. The decision was a practical one. The Bureau needed to allocate its resources to more pressing national security threats and modern criminal investigations, while they would still accept any legitimate physical evidence, like the rest of the money or pieces of the parachute. They would no longer actively pursue tips or theories. The official closing of the case was a quiet, anticlimactic end to the biggest wild goose chase in their history. The hijacker had won. His victory leaves behind the great unanswered question at the heart of the legend. Did he survive the jump? The official FBI position and the most logical conclusion is that he did not. The odds were astronomically against him. He jumped into a freezing nocturnal thunderstorm with 150-mile-per-hour winds, wearing only a business suit. It was an act of near-certain suicide. The fact that the money was never spent and the small bundle found at Tena's bar was partially disintegrated strongly supports the theory that he perished and his loot was scattered by the elements, his body and parachute consumed by the forest. Yet, the argument for his survival remains stubbornly compelling. This was a man who planned every other detail with meticulous, cool-headed precision. He knew the aircraft, he knew the flight parameters, and he knew enough to check his gear and discard the faulty parachute. Would such a careful planner have undertaken a jump that was truly impossible? Proponents of the survival theory argue he may have been an elite military paratrooper, like a Green Beret, trained for exactly these kinds of high-risk nighttime jumps. They suggest he likely had an accomplice on the ground, a predetermined landing zone, and a clean getaway plan. For them, the fact that no body, no parachute, and no briefcase were ever found is not evidence of his death, but rather the ultimate proof of his success. Today, D.B. Cooper is more than just an unsolved case. He is a permanent fixture in the American cultural landscape. He is the ultimate anti-hero, a symbol of rebellion against a faceless system. In an era of disillusionment, he was the guy who took on the government and the airlines and won, vanishing into the night with a fortune. He has been the subject of songs, the inspiration for movie characters, and a recurring reference in television shows. He represents a fantasy of escape, a ghost who embodies the seductive idea that it's possible to simply walk away from it all and start a new life. The mystery endures, not because of the crime itself, but because of the perfect void it left behind. It's a blank slate onto which anyone can project their own theory, their own hero, their own ending. The man may be long dead, but the ghost of D.B. Cooper, the gentleman bandit who stepped out of a plane and into a legend, will likely fly on forever. Was D.B. Cooper a brilliant folk hero who escaped with a fortune, or a reckless fool who fell to his death in the unforgiving wilderness? The FBI may have officially closed the case, but the legend will never die, remaining one of history's most tantalizing unsolved crimes. It's a story that truly belongs in our darkest chapters. If you want to journey into more of these enduring mysteries and explore the stories that refuse to be forgotten, make sure you subscribe to Dark Chapters and click the notification bell. You won't want to miss where we go next.